What would you do if the only home you had ever known was sold out from under you? If you were cast out at 18 with nothing but $100 and a ghost's advice? What if you used that pittance to buy a place whispered to be cursed, a ruin considered utterly worthless? And what if hidden within that ruin was a secret that would not only save your life, but give it meaning? Alara stood on the porch of the ferryman's house, the house where she had been born, and watched her stepfather supervise the loading of her mother's china into a stranger's wagon. He did not look at her. He had not truly looked at her in the 6 weeks since the funeral, his gaze always sliding past her shoulder as if she were a pane of glass. She was 18, an inconvenient artifact of a life he was now eager to dismantle and discard. The air, thick with the river's humid breath and the scent of cut grass, felt heavy and suffocating. She did not cry. She did not plead. The lessons her father had taught her before the river took him were not about pleading. They were about reading the current, about the honest grain of wood, about the unwavering truth of a plumb line. He had been the ferryman, his hands calloused and kind, smelling of pine resin and engine oil. He had taught her how to splice a rope so it was stronger at the join, how to read the sky for weather, and how to caulk a seam so not a single tear of river could weep through. "Competence is a fortress, Ellie," he would say, his voice a low rumble. "Build it strong, and it will shelter you when all else fails." Her fortress felt very far away. Her stepfather, a man of soft hands and ledger books, had sold the ferry, the house, everything. He approached her now, his shoes crunching on the gravel path. He avoided her eyes, focusing instead on a point somewhere over the roiling brown water of the wide river. "The new owners will be here by evening," he said. His voice was flat, administrative. "I've settled your portion." He held out an envelope. Inside, she knew, were 5 $20 bills, $100, the final accounting for a childhood, for a lineage of riverfolk stretching back generations. It was a sum chosen for its calculated insult. He was not just removing her, he was erasing her. "There is a coach that leaves for the capital at 6, he added. "It would be best if you were on it." Alara looked at his tie, a silk thing the color of a bruise. She said nothing. Her silence was a dam holding back a grief so vast it felt like the river itself. To speak would be to break, and her father had taught her that some things, once broken, could never be truly mended. Instead, her hand went to the worn leather satchel at her hip. Inside, wrapped in an oilcloth, were her father's tools, a small, sharp adze, a set of wood chisels, and his dovetail saw, and in a pocket sewn into the lining of her coat, she felt the familiar, dense weight of the one thing she had taken for herself. It was a heavy, ornate brass key. It was not a key to any door in the house. It was the master key for the old ferry's engine housing, a complex piece of brass her father had machined himself, its teeth a unique and intricate language only he and she understood. It was useless now, a relic of a defunct machine, but it was a tangible piece of his competence. It was her inheritance. Without a word, she turned her back on her stepfather, on the house that was no longer a home, and walked down the gravel path toward the road. She did not look back. To look back was to invite the ghosts of what was lost to follow her, and she knew she would need all her strength for the journey ahead. The $100 felt like a cold stone in her pocket, the brass key like a single, warm ember. She did not take the coach to the capital. The capital was a place of ledgers and soft hands, a place for men like her stepfather. Her father's world had been one of grit and water, of stone and timber. She walked west, away from the wide, slow river of her childhood, and toward the rugged hill country where the tributaries were born. For 3 days she walked, sleeping in haylofts and spending her coins sparingly on bread and cheese. The landscape grew harsher, the hills sharper, the trees turning from lush hardwoods to gnarled, hardy pines. The people, too, were different. Their faces were weathered, their words fewer, their eyes appraising. They looked at her hands, saw the faint calluses, and left her be. On the fourth night, she found herself in a small, gritty town, huddled in a narrow valley, a place called Terminus. It smelled of coal smoke and wet rock. She paid a few cents for a bowl of watery stew in a tavern filled with miners and loggers. Their talk was a low growl, a litany of dangers and wages. But then, she overheard a conversation from a nearby table that cut through the noise. A man in a land agent's coat was speaking to a pair of burly, bearded men. "It's a liability, is what it is," the agent said, sipping his whiskey. "The county wants it off the books. Been abandoned for 50 years. They say old man Silas cursed it with his dying breath." "Sorrow's End?" one of the loggers scoffed. "Who'd be fool enough to want that pile of rocks? The ferry's sunk, the tower's crumbling. River's too treacherous for a crossing there anyway. That's why they put the bridge in down at Haven." "Still," the agent said, a smirk playing on his lips, "the deed is clear. A stone ferry house, the tower, and riparian rights for a quarter mile. The commissioners have set the price for a quitclaim deed at $1, a single dollar, just to be shed of it." The men laughed, a harsh, booming sound. They called it Silas's folly, a testament to a madman's pride. They spoke of treacherous currents, of ghosts, of the sheer impossibility of the place. But Alara heard something else beneath their mockery. She heard Stone Ferry House. She heard Tower. She heard the name of a man, Silas, who had built something where others said it could not be built. It sounded like a place her father would have respected. The next morning, she walked into the county clerk's office, a dusty room that smelled of dry paper and stale tobacco. The agent from the tavern sat behind a tall desk, looking bored. He glanced up as she approached, his eyes taking in her worn dress and the satchel at her side. "I'm here about the property," Alara said, her voice quiet but clear. "The one called Sorrow's End." The agent, a man named Pike, blinked. Then a slow, incredulous smile spread across his face. "Well, I'll be? You're serious?" He leaned back in his chair, enjoying the novelty. "Girl, there's nothing there but snakes and rotten wood. The river will pull you under if the rocks don't fall on you first." "I have the dollar," she said, pulling one of the crisp bills from her pocket and laying it on the desk. She met his gaze without flinching. He stared at her for a long moment, the amusement in his eyes turning to a kind of pitying contempt. He saw a foolish, desperate girl. He did not see the fortress behind her eyes. He did not see the legacy of competence that flowed in her blood. Shaking his head, he pulled a pre-written deed from a drawer, dipped a pen in ink, and scrawled her name where it said, "Grantee." "Your funeral," he muttered, sanding the ink. He took her dollar, made change from a tin box, and pushed 99 cents in the folded document across the desk. "It's a 10-mile walk upriver. Follow the old towpath. Can't miss the ruin. No one's been mad enough to build anything else near it." Alara took the deed and the coins. She felt a strange, grim flicker of something that might have been hope. She had traded one insult, the $100, for another, a worthless ruin. But this insult was hers. She had chosen it. She owned it. Walking out of the clerk's office and into the pale morning light, she felt the weight of the $99.99 in her pocket. It was almost everything she had in the world, and it felt like a fortune. The 10 miles were a pilgrimage into solitude. The towpath was overgrown, a faint scar on the landscape that followed the increasingly wild river. The water here was not the slow, muddy giant of her home. It was a furious, green and white torrent, crashing through a gorge of black rock. The air grew cleaner, sharper, scented with pine and damp stone. She saw no one. The only sounds were the river's roar and the cry of a hawk circling high overhead. Then she saw it. Perched on a narrow shelf of granite where the gorge widened slightly was a ruin. Pike had not exaggerated. It was a skeleton. A square stone tower, perhaps 30 feet high, stood defiant, its roof gone, its windows like empty eye sockets. Attached to it was the collapsed remnant of a cottage, its timber roof caved in, its walls a jumble of fallen stone and rotting wood. Leading down to the water's edge was a set of steep stone steps, and at the bottom, half submerged in a churning eddy, was the skeletal barge of a ferry, its deck planks gone, its ribs black with rot. A massive, rust-eaten chain snaked from a winch house near the tower, ran through a pulley on a stone pier, and disappeared into the water, snapped and useless. Sorrow's End. The name felt apt. A wave of despair, cold and sharp as the river's spray, washed over her. The mockery of the men in the tavern echoed in her ears. What had she done? She had traded her last hope for a pile of rubble and a ghost story. She sank onto a moss-covered rock, the useless deed clutched in her hand, and for the first time since her mother's death, she felt the dam of her composure begin to crack. The sheer, overwhelming loneliness of her situation was a physical weight, but she did not weep. Her father's voice, a memory but clear as a bell, spoke in her mind. "When you're lost, Ellie, stop. Don't panic. Just assess. What do you have? What is solid?" She took a deep, shuddering breath of the pine-scented air and forced herself to stand. Assess. She was a shipwright's daughter. She understood structure. She walked slowly toward the ruin, her eyes not on the collapse, but on what remained. The tower. The stonework was magnificent. The massive, irregular blocks of granite were fitted together with a precision that defied the decades of neglect. There were no mortar lines. It was dry stone construction of a masterful quality she had only read about in her father's engineering books. This was not the work of a madman. This was the work of a genius. Inside, the tower was a single, circular room. The sky was a disk of blue far above. The floor was thick with debris, leaves, dirt, the nests of birds and rats. A huge stone fireplace, big enough to stand in, was built into the thickest wall. The air was cold and smelled of dust and damp earth. But it was solid. The walls were true. This was the fortress her father had spoken of. It was broken, but its bones were good. She spent the rest of the day clearing a small section of the floor near the hearth. She used her adze to cut away the tangled roots that had breached the threshold, and her bare hands to haul out stones and debris. By dusk, she had a small, clean space. She gathered fallen pine branches, and using a flint and steel from her satchel, she laid a fire in the great hearth. As the flames caught, chasing the chill from the stone and painting the circular walls with dancing light, a profound sense of purpose began to settle over her. This was not a grave. It was a beginning. Her first night as a landowner was spent wrapped in her coat on a stone floor, the river roaring its endless song outside, the fire a defiant star against the crushing dark. The next days fell into a rhythm of methodical labor. She worked from dawn until her muscles screamed at dusk. Her first task was to secure her shelter. She salvaged timbers from the collapsed cottage, painstakingly pulling nails, assessing the wood for rot. Most was useless, but she found a few solid oak beams. Using her saw and chisels, she began to frame a crude, lean-to roof over one section of the cottage ruins abutting the tower, creating a small, three-walled room. For roofing, she harvested wide sheets of birch bark from fallen trees, layering them like shingles. It was slow, arduous work. Every nail was a treasure. Every sound piece of wood was a victory. Her hands, soft from weeks of idleness, blistered, then bled, then hardened into the familiar calluses of her youth. She grew leaner, tougher. The hollow ache of grief began to recede, replaced by the satisfying ache of physical exhaustion. She was not just surviving, she was building. It was during the cleaning of the tower's great hearth that she found it. She was clearing out decades of soot, ash, and rubble, preparing to check the flue. Her fingers, coated in black grime, brushed against one of the stones in the curved back wall of the firebox. It felt different. While the other stones were rough, heat-cracked granite, this one was smooth, a piece of polished river stone. Curious, she scraped away the soot. It was a different color, a dark, dense basalt, and it was fitted into the arch with a precision that was almost invisible. It was an anomaly. Her father had taught her to trust anomalies. "Nature loves patterns," he'd said, pointing to the ripples on the water. "A man's work does too. When the pattern breaks, there's a reason." She pushed at the stone. It didn't move. She tried to find a purchase with her fingertips, but the seams were too tight. She ran her hand over its surface again, feeling for any irregularity. Near the bottom, almost hidden in the grime, she felt a tiny, recessed hole, no bigger than a nail head. It was a keyhole. But not for a normal key. It was too small, too deep. Her heart began to beat faster. She thought of the heavy brass key in her coat pocket. It was absurd. It was for a ferry engine, miles and years away. But the thought, once it took root, would not be dismissed. She retrieved it, its brass warm and familiar in her palm. The key's shaft was long and slender, but its intricate tip was far too large for the tiny hole. She looked closer at the key, an object she had held 1,000 times. She saw something she had never noticed before. The ornate, flower-shaped head of the key was not a single piece of brass. It was 2 pieces, fitted together with a seam as fine as a hair. Using the tip of her smallest chisel, she found the seam and twisted. With a faint click, the head of the key unscrewed. Inside, nested within the hollow shaft, was another key. A tiny steel needle of a key, with a single, minuscule and complex tooth at its end. Her hands trembled as she inserted the needle key into the hidden hole in the hearthstone. It slid in perfectly. She turned it. There was no sound, but she felt a faint, deep vibration through the stone, the sound of a well-oiled mechanism releasing. She pushed at the basalt stone again, and this time it swung inward on a hidden, silent pivot, revealing a dark, square cavity. The air that drifted out was cool and dry, smelling not of damp or decay, but of old leather and metal. Reaching inside, her fingers brushed against the cold iron bands of a small, heavy chest. It took all her strength to pull it out. It was a seaman's chest, made of dark, heavy wood and bound with forged iron. It was not locked. With a deep breath, she lifted the lid. The sight stole the air from her lungs. The chest was filled to the brim with gold coins. Not dollars, but old, heavy foreign coins, Spanish doubloons, French louis d'or, English sovereigns, gleaming with a soft, buttery light in the dimness of the tower. It was a fortune beyond comprehension. Lying on top of the coins was a single object wrapped in oilcloth, a leather-bound logbook, its cover stamped with a single, elegant letter, S. For a long time, Alara could only stare. The gold was incomprehensible, an abstraction. It was the book that felt real. She carefully lifted it out. The leather was supple, the pages thick and creamy. The handwriting inside was a strong, clear engineer script. The first page read, "The log of Silas Croft, master mason and ferryman. This crossing, which others will call Sorrow's End, I call Providence. May whoever finds this have need of it." She sat by her small fire, the gold forgotten in its chest, and began to read. Silas's story unfolded, a quiet testament written over 30 years. He had been a brilliant young engineer and stonemason in a city far to the east. He had designed a revolutionary new bridge system, but his partner, a man of wealth and connections, had stolen the plans, patented them as his own, and had Silas ruined and exiled on false charges of fraud. Betrayed and heartbroken, with only a small stake of hidden gold, Silas had journeyed west until he could go no further. He found the impassable gorge and saw not an obstacle, but a challenge. His words echoed the lessons of her own father. He wrote of competence as the only true solace. He wrote of the joy of fitting one stone perfectly to another, of calculating the stresses of a chain against a current, of building something true and lasting in a world of lies. He had built the crossing not for commerce, but for himself, a fortress of solitude. The parallels to her own life were uncanny, a mirror held up across a 50-year gulf. The betrayal, the exile, the finding of refuge in methodical work. It felt less like reading a stranger's diary, and more like receiving a letter from kin. In the final entry, written in a shaky hand, Silas explained the hidden chest. "The river will claim me soon," he wrote. "I have no heir. This gold is the last remnant of the life that was stolen from me. It is useless to a dead man. But the world is full of broken hearts and empty pockets. If you have found this, it is because you have the wit to see the pattern, and the need to seek shelter within these walls. The curse I leave is not on this land, but on any who would seek to exploit it. The blessing I leave is for the one who comes to build. Use this gold, reforge the chain, replank the ferry, make the crossing live again. It is a good life, to carry people over dark water. It is a good home. May you find peace here, as I have. It is all yours now. Providence." Tears streamed down Alara's face, the first she had shed. They were not tears of grief for what she had lost, but tears of profound, aching gratitude for what she had found. She was not alone. A ghost, a kindred spirit, had left her not just a fortune, but a purpose, a blessing. The next morning, the world looked different. The ruin was no longer a symbol of her desperation, but a canvas for her purpose. The gold was not a treasure to be hoarded, but a tool to be used. She was no longer an outcast. She was the heir to sorrow's end. She was the ferryman. The work began in earnest. Her first journey was back to Terminus. She walked into Maeve's general store, a place she had previously avoided, her $99 feeling like too little. Maeve, a stout woman with kind, shrewd eyes, watched as Alara walked in. Alara bought flour, salt, beans, a proper cast-iron skillet, and a new axe head. She paid with one of the heavy gold coins. Maeve picked up the coin, weighed it in her palm, and looked at Alara, her expression unreadable. She did not ask where it came from. She simply nodded, went to a locked safe in the back, and returned with a heavy pouch of silver and copper coins for change. "You're the girl who bought the Silas place," she stated, not asked. "I am," Alara said. "Folks say it's a fool's errand." "The work is honest," Alara replied, meeting her gaze. A flicker of respect passed through Maeve's eyes. "That it is," she said. "You'll need supplies. I can have my boy run a wagon up the old path once a fortnight. Settle up when you can." It was an offer of credit, of trust, extended not from pity but from an appraisal of character. It was the first act of community she had known since her father's death. Her next stop was the blacksmith's forge at the edge of town. The smith, a mountain of a man named Cormac with a beard like iron filings, was hammering a glowing horseshoe into shape. The ring of his hammer was a song of pure function. Alara waited until he was done. "I need chain forged," she said, her voice nearly lost in the forge's din. He grunted, barely looking at her. "I make shoes and plowshares, not anchor chain." Instead of arguing, Alara unrolled a piece of parchment on a clear corner of his workbench. On it, she had drawn, with charcoal from her fire, a precise diagram of the broken ferry chain links. She had included measurements, stress calculations, and a cross-section showing the crystalline structure of the rusted iron. She had even specified the carbon content needed for the new steel to withstand the river's corrosive power. Cormac stopped, his hammer held in midair. He stared at the drawing, his professional eye missing no detail. He looked from the drawing to Alara, then back again. He saw not a girl, but a fellow craftsman. "Where did you learn this?" he asked. his voice a low rumble of surprise. "My father was a shipwright," she said simply. He grunted again, but it was a different sound this time. It was a sound of approval. "This is good work," he said, tapping the drawing. "But it will cost you." Alara placed 2 gold coins on the parchment. Cormac's eyebrows rose. He picked one up, bit it, and then tossed it back. "One will do for the material and my time," he said gruffly. The other will pay for you to use the second forge. You drew the plan. You'll help with the striking. You'll earn the lesson." And so began an unlikely partnership. For weeks, Alara split her time. Mornings were spent at Sorrow's End, quarrying stone from the collapsed cottage walls and meticulously rebuilding them, chinking the gaps with a mortar of her own devising from clay and sand. Afternoons were spent at the forge, the heat a blistering inferno. Cormac, a harsh but fair teacher, showed her how to manage the bellows, how to read the color of the steel, when to strike, and when to quench. She learned the feel of the hammer, the rhythm of the work, the deep satisfaction of turning raw, brittle iron into strong, flexible steel. Together they forged 24 massive new links for the ferry chain, each one a testament to their shared respect for the craft. During one of her supply trips, she met Ben, an old trapper who lived in a cabin upriver from her crossing. He was a wiry man with a face like a weathered map, his eyes the pale, clear blue of the winter sky. He had watched her from the far bank for weeks. "You're Silas's girl now," he said, his voice raspy. He had appeared silently at her side as she was planing a salvaged beam. Alara was startled, but not frightened. "His heir, I suppose." "He was a good man. Quiet. Knew the river," Ben said. He looked at her work, the neat dovetail joints she was cutting for a new window frame. "You know your tools. That's good. Silas would have liked that." He told her stories of the crossing's builder, filling in the gaps in the logbook. He told her where to find a stand of old-growth heartwood pine, rot-resistant and strong, perfect for rebuilding the ferry's barge. He taught her how to read the river's moods, the subtle signs that predicted a rise in water level, the safe eddies and the treacherous undertows. His currency was knowledge, and he shared it freely, recognizing in her the same quiet competence and respect for the wild place that he possessed. With Cormac's chain, Ben's wood, and Maeve's supplies, the crossing was slowly reborn. Alara, using Silas's own diagrams from the logbook, repaired the great winch mechanism. She spent a month of back-breaking labor with block and tackle, raising the sunken ferry barge. It was a skeleton, but its oak ribs were mostly sound. Day by day, plank by plank, she gave it a new skin of heartwood pine, caulking the seams with pitch and oakum until it was watertight and beautiful. She mended the snapped chain with the newly forged links, the dark, new steel a stark contrast to the rust of the old. She rebuilt the cottage, stone by stone. She milled her own timbers, cut her own shingles, and even reglazed a window with the small pane of glass Maeve had ordered for her. The place transformed from a ruin into a home. The tower stood as a silent, stone guardian, and the cottage nestled against it, smoke curling cheerfully from its new chimney. It was a fortress of competence, just as her father had said. A fortress built by her own 2 hands, guided by the spirits of 2 men she had loved, one by blood, one by legacy. One day in late autumn, the land agent, Pike, rode up the towpath. He was leading a pair of well-dressed men from the capital. He stared at the transformed crossing, his mouth agape. The neat cottage, the sturdy ferry floating in the eddy, the smoke from the chimney. It was an impossibility. "We heard rumors," he stammered, looking at Alara as if she were a ghost. "They said you'd found gold." "I found a good foundation," Alara replied coolly, wiping grease from her hands with a rag. She had just finished tuning the winch gears. "This property is historically significant," one of the city men blustered. "It can't be owned by a squatter. We're prepared to offer you a generous sum to relinquish your claim. $1,000. Ilara looked at them, at their soft hands and expensive coats. They were men like her stepfather. They saw only money, not the work, not the history, not the home. She thought of Silas's curse on exploiters. "The deed is in my name," she said, her voice as solid as the tower behind her. "The price was $1. This property is not for sale." Pike's face purpled with frustration and humiliation. He had sold a fortune for a joke. The story of his folly and her triumph became a local legend, a quiet source of satisfaction for Cormac, Maeve, and Ben. Winter passed. Ilara spent the cold months finishing the interior of the cottage, carving furniture and reading her father's engineering books by the light of the fire. She felt a deep, quiet contentment she had never known. She was not lonely. She was solitary. The spirits of her father and Silas were her constant companions, their wisdom embedded in the very walls around her. The first sign of the climax came with the spring thaw. A week of unnaturally warm weather melted the deep mountain snowpack all at once. The river, the wild green torrent she had come to know, began to change. It turned a sullen, muddy brown and swelled with terrifying speed. Ben had warned her of the freshet, the violent spring floods that could scour the gorge clean. The river rose, and it rose. It roared, no longer a song but a deafening, terrifying expression of raw power. It carried entire trees, debris, and the bodies of drowned livestock. Ilara secured the ferry, tightening the winch chain until the barge was pinned fast against the stone pier, riding high on the rising water. She brought her tools and supplies into the tower, the one place she knew would stand against anything. On the second night of the flood, through the howling wind and rain, she heard a desperate shouting. Peering from a window in the tower, she saw a lantern waving frantically on the far bank. A horse and wagon were stranded, the water rising around them. It was Maeve's boy caught trying to make a delivery to an outlying homestead. Then came a sound deeper and more terrible than the river's roar, a groaning, screaming tear of metal, and a colossal crash that echoed through the gorge. Ben, who had made his way to her tower for safety, looked at her, his face grim in the lantern light. "The bridge," he said. "The Haven Bridge just went." The town of Terminus was cut in half, its doctor, its main supplies, all on the other side, and Maeve's boy was trapped. Panic was a certainty. Ilara looked at the raging water, a liquid monster in the dark. She looked at her ferry, straining at its chain but holding fast. She thought of Silas's words. "It is a good life to carry people over dark water." "I can do it," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "The crossing will hold." Ben argued it was suicide, but he saw the look in her eye, the same unshakable competence that had built this place. Together they went out into the storm. Releasing the winch brake was an act of faith. The ferry bucked and swung out into the main current, the chain groaning under the immense strain. But the work of Silas, the masonry of the piers, held true. The work of Cormac, the forged steel of the chain, held true. And the work of Ilara, the sturdy planking and caulking of the barge, held true. Using a long sweep oar to keep the barge from being smashed against the rocks, her father's lessons on reading currents guiding her every move, she fought her way across the torrent. It was a brutal, terrifying battle against the river's fury. She reached the other side, her arms burning, her body soaked and frozen, and got Maeve's terrified boy and his horse onto the barge. The journey back was even more perilous, but she made it. All through the next day, as the floodwaters crested, Ilara became a lifeline. She was no longer a recluse in a ruin. She was the ferryman of Sorrow's End Crossing. She transported the town doctor and his medical bag. She carried food and blankets. She brought families separated by the flood back together. People who had once mocked her now looked at her with awe and gratitude, their lives and the well-being of their town literally in her hands. She charged no fare. This was not commerce. This was community. This was service. When the flood finally receded, leaving a thick blanket of silt over the valley. The bridge at Haven was a mangled wreck. It would be a year, maybe more, before it could be rebuilt. The crossing at Sorrow's End was the only way across the river for 20 miles. Alara stood on her stone porch, watching the morning mist burn off the water. A small, orderly line of people and wagons waited on the far bank for her first run of the day. Among them, she saw the land agent, Pike, needing to get to the other side to assess damages. He would have to pay her toll. The irony was a quiet, satisfying note in the peaceful morning air. Her home was whole. Her purpose was clear. She was part of this place, woven into its fabric as surely as the stones in her walls. That evening she sat before her fire in the cottage she had built. The air smelled of wood smoke and beeswax. On the mantelpiece, a smooth, sturdy shelf of polished oak, sat two objects side by side. One was her father's heavy brass key, its hidden needle returned to its heart. The other was a small, exquisitely carved stone bird she had found at the very bottom of Silas's chest, a final, personal token from the master mason. They were the symbols of her two inheritances, the legacy of skill and the legacy of sanctuary. She looked at the quiet, solid evidence of her new life, a life built from the wreckage of another. She had been cast out with nothing but a pittance and a memory. She had been given a ruin, a curse, a folly, but she had seen the good bones beneath the decay. She had honored the work, and in doing so, had found her own salvation. The narration of her own life had found its rhythm, its purpose. The $1 she had paid to a mocking clerk for a pile of stones had bought her a home, a community, and a soul-deep sense of peace. It was, without a doubt, the best money she had ever spent.